Okay, so today I am going to attach the straight sleeve from the Farrow dress pattern to the armhole. So I have a sleeve right here. I'm going to go ahead and sew it right side out. Whenever I begin a sleeve or an underarm seam or a shoulder, I'm always going to work from the top down. So when I start constructing the sleeve, I'm not going to sew from the hem to the armhole. I'm always going to sew from the armhole to the hem. That's because if any discrepancies happen, I want them to happen in the hem where it can be fixed, but it cannot be fixed in the armhole where it's really contingent on another piece fitting into. Same thing with constructing the side seam of a garment. The side seam needs to always be constructed from the top down. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch at a 1/2 inch. When I'm stitching all the way through the seam allowance and on that straight 1/2 inch. So I'm going to trim my thread. I am going to go ahead and turn my sleeve, turn my sleeve inside out. At this point, it would be a good stage to go ahead and press it though. So I'm going to go ahead and finger press mine. All the way down, just to open up that seam. So I would take it to the iron at this point before it's constructed into the garment. So I'm going to reach inside to the hem and pull that hem all the way through so that I can now attach it to my garment. I have some armhole notches in the back and the front of my sleeve, and so the single notch tells me that is the front of the sleeve, and the double armhole notch tells me that that is the back. So I'm going to find the corresponding notches on my pattern. And in theory, I can open up the back zipper of my dress if that helps. And I can line up my underarm seam with the inside seam of my garment. So I'm going to make sure all of those seams are open, and I'm putting the seam to seam so that the right sides of each are together, of the garment and the sleeve. And I'm going to work from inside the garment, pivoting the sleeve around to set it in. So I'm going to make sure that those back armhole notches match. And then work around the front. And I'm going to show you something here. So my sleeve always has to be the same size or bigger than the armhole. The armhole cannot be bigger than the sleeve, otherwise there's going to be a gap. So I've pinned from my double armhole notch down around the bottom of the sleeve to the front of the armhole. But what I do need to do to make this fit, instead of like bunching it in and really puckering it, is I'm going to take out one pin and I'm going to go ahead and do a gathering stitch in the seam allowance of the sleeve. So I'm going to turn my stitch length up to the longest stitch length, and from the back armhole notch to the front armhole notch, I'm going to go ahead and do a gathering stitch. So I'm not going to back stitch here. I'm just going to do a straight stitch, no back stitching, and I'm going to make sure that I have long tails to start with. so that I can pull on those to gather my thread in. And this is going to help me set in that sleeve. So I'm stitching in the seam allowance. I'm stitching about 1/4 of an inch away from the actual stitch line so that my ease will not show through the garment. I don't want it too close to the stitch line because then I'm going to see those puckers. They're going to be more pronounced when I construct this. So I'm gently sewing around this curve. And as I approach this front armhole notch, I'm not sewing the garment to anything, I'm just sewing that sleeve cap. As I get to the front armhole notch, I'm going to crank the wheel of my sewing machine just to release those threads. And now I'm ready to gather my sleeve. So I'm sewing with a different colored top thread than bobbin thread, and I'm going to go ahead and gather my top thread, which is the dark one. If I mix my threads and I gather the top from my right side and the bottom from the left side, it's going to lock those threads in, and essentially I'll need to either rip them out or start all over, do another stitch line, because it really does lock them in, and once they are locked in, it cannot be undone. So I'm gathering those threads. I'm using my fingernails to promote that fullness towards the center. You also don't want to snap your thread or pull too brusquely on it. It is pretty fragile. And I'm just creating a little bit of ease so that this sleeve is going to pop up a little bit and set in nicely to that shoulder seam. So it starts to take shape and really look like a shoulder, just like that. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and compare it to the garment. And I can see if I've gathered too much, so I can easily let that out, or if I need to gather some more. I think I'm like right at about where I need to be. I do not need to worry about tying off those threads because it's going to get stitched into the seam. Side. I'm pinning evenly on each side just to make sure my sleeve is where I want it to be. Just where I want it. So I don't have any extra fullness. It doesn't look too tight. If I have a little puckering, I'm okay with it. But I can go ahead, I'm going to flip my seam over so that I'm sewing from the inside of the sleeve towards me, and the garment is on the outside, and I'm going to begin stitching this at 1/2 inch. That's what my seam allowance is. And as I'm sewing, I'm going to make sure also that none of my fabric is puckered on that seam, so I can really feel with my fingertips and make sure that that seam is feeling smooth. And I'm going to turn my stitch length back down, and I'm stitching and back stitching, beginning at the underarm seam, which I matched for the underarm of the sleeve and the side seam of the garment. So as I pivot around, I'm being careful here to stitch on that stitch line that I carefully marked. And I'm rotating this fabric. It's okay if I have some puckers on the sleeve. It's not okay if I have puckers on the actual garment. And while I'm sewing, if I notice there's like particular fullness, I can go ahead, smooth that out by hand. The reason we only gather the sleeve cap, so the top of the sleeve, is because it's okay if there's fullness up there. You wouldn't want to feel fullness on your underarm. That would feel like a lot of bulk or, you know, really kind of uncomfortable. And we also need it at the top of the sleeve so that we have range of motion in our garment for our arms to move around. So once I turn it, my sleeve is completely set in, just like so. It's really nice, really smooth. I have it, maybe some tiny puckers, but overall set in. Once my seam allowance is pushed out towards the sleeve, it becomes pretty crisp. And that is setting in the sleeve of this garment. I am also going to finish this armhole by bias binding it. So I have some bias binding prepared. I want to make sure that this is long enough. And so I can go back into my sleeve. And I can do a double fold bias binding, trimming my threads, of course. I don't need to tie off those gathered ends. Now that it's stitched in, it cannot go anywhere. So I can just trim those threads. I am going to go ahead and start attaching my bias. So for this one, I'm just going to simply fold the bias. It's already ironed into quarters. I'm going to go ahead and start at that underarm seam, and I'm going to fold it so that the edge of the seam is directly in half, and I'm going to go ahead and just top stitch it on both sides. You can pin this all the way around as well. I'm going to go really slow and make sure that I am keeping sure that my seam allowance is pushed all the way inside the fold of the bias. And again, because I'm sewing around a curve, this is something I do need to pivot for quite often. So I'm catching that bias, just like so. This is going to encapsulate all of that seam allowance, making sure that I have a very clean, finished armhole inside the garment. So when I'm getting close to the end, I'm going to go ahead and trim it enough so that I have enough for an overlap, but also for me to open this up and fold it in and create a finished edge here. And so that's just how I wrap up the end of the bias binding. Just like so. So when I open it, my bias is completely bound on the inside and the outside, just like that. Totally clean. From the outside, it does not affect my garment at all because I'm stitching right inside of the stitch line of the sleeve. So my armhole is completely finished.